This episode is brought to you by Bridges Academy Online, an online high school for twice exceptional students. Find them at bridges.edu.
I like to think it really makes our connection with each other stronger. They're open to things that I say because I'm not going to place a demand on them really quickly.
Neurodivergent people often communicate differently from the norm. As a parent, it's sometimes difficult to communicate your wishes to your neurodivergent kids, whether it's asking them to do something or just getting them to open up and tell you how they feel. Declarative language is a great tool to promote smoother and more effective communication and keep them on course. Linda Murphy is the author of The Declarative Language Handbook, and she joins us on episode 155. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Thanks to everyone who submitted questions for the latest Ask Me Anything episode. If you missed it, look for episode 153. We get all of the questions for the AMA from Facebook, from members of the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. We'll put a link in the show notes so that you can join the group. One other thing, before we bring on Linda Murphy, we now have Pod Swag. We have t-shirts, mugs, stickers, and more, and it's available on our website. We'll put a link in the show notes for that as well. If you're looking for a way to support the podcast and you think that you need more witty t-shirts in your life, be sure to check it out. Declarative language is next. Stay with us.
On a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
I think there is this kind of in our cultural DNA still, this idea that properly behaving, children should be seen and not heard. I think there's kind of this mystical, unspoken idea that behavior management is appropriate and somehow valued. Somehow, with how the research was interpreted as successful, it became the mainstay of our education system. And when you look at the science, the neuroscience of resilience, and you lay that side by side to behavioral management, the two don't line up very well.
That's episode 116. Find it in your favorite podcast app.
You are listening to the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Linda Murphy is our guest today. Linda is a speech-language pathologist and the author of several books, including the Declarative Language Handbook and the Co-Regulation Handbook. So Linda, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I think if we had to find a collective characteristic that a lot of different neurodivergent people experience, it is that we communicate differently than what is considered the quote-unquote neurotypical norm. And I'm generalizing, of course, but I do think that we spend a lot of time focusing on how we can best shift communication for people. And declarative language is one way that we can shift our language. So can you tell us a little bit about what declarative language is?
Sure. When I do trainings, I find it's easier to first talk about what declarative language is not. So I'll start there. The opposite of declarative language is imperative language. And imperative language is just discrete language that places a very specific demand on an individual to do something, or for example, to say something. So examples might be put your shoes on, throw that away, stand up, sit down, that sort of thing. Say thank you. Those are all imperatives. Also, not declarative is question. So question asking is just, could be anything. What's your name? How is your day? So also not declarative. And what imperative and questions have in common is, as I said, they place demands on an individual to do something in the moment. So it might be to formulate language in the moment in the form of a response, or it might be a demand to do something. So declarative, we just flip that all on our head and we just comment, and we comment in the moment. So for example, put your shoes on as a declarative might be, I see your shoes over there, or I think it's a great idea to put on your shoes, or I think you need your shoes. So those are just comments in the moment that maybe guide a learner toward what they might need to do. So that, there's different ways or reasons that we might use declarative language that we'll probably get into. But also on its very basic level, declarative language is about experience sharing. So we're just commenting, like if you think about with a very young learner, you're just commenting on the immediate environment. So with a baby or a toddler, it might be, wow, look at the airplane in the sky, or I heard the dog barking too, or woof, that diaper really stinks. So it's just comments in the moment that don't place any demand at all. It's just communication for experience sharing and an invitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's not even a requirement to reply.
Right.
It can just be very much about what's happening right here, right now in this present moment.
Right.
Sometimes we do these Ask Me Anything episodes, and in one of them I mentioned declarative language, and one of our listeners actually emailed and was perhaps both, I think, a little bit confused and also concerned because she said she wasn't sure what that meant when I said it in the episode, and so she researched a bit more about declarative language. But to her, it sounded a lot like the passive-aggressive communication that she experienced in her family growing up, which I can totally see how it could be interpreted that way. So how is it different? How is declarative language different from that?
So on a mechanical level, passive-aggressive statements are also declarative statements. But the way that I write about it and the way that I want people to use is as a whole communicative package with positive intentions behind it. So when we communicate in a declarative way, and the way that I want to communicate with learners, and I'd like other people to do, is in this positive way that starts with a positive intention. And passive aggressiveness happens when your words spoken and your nonverbal communication do not align, or there's a mismatch. So you might be saying something, but you're saying it with a sarcastic tone or a snarky tone. So all of a sudden it becomes a demand. So if you're using a declarative statement and there really is secretly a demand behind it, or nonverbal communication that does not have that positive intention behind it, then the other person is going to perceive passive aggressiveness. So when I want to communicate with our learners, I want to have that whole presence in my nonverbal communication. So that's my tone of voice, my facial expressions, my gestures, my body position, all those pieces, and then add the declarative comment onto it. And that's the communicator I want to be. And that's the communicator that really supports our learners the most in the moment.
What are some reasons why this is beneficial? Like, what are the benefits to using this?
So what I always think about is a lot of our learners or individuals with social learning differences, they might experience anxiety around different things, certainly around demands in the moment that they may or may not feel that they can be competent in, or just they feel uncertain of. So anytime they feel a demand, it can create a stress response. Stress responses can create or lead to fight, flight, freeze behaviors, or what is seen as challenging behaviors on our end. So, but really it's just that stress response, that fight, flight, freeze, and it's an observable challenging behavior. And even just to get into that a little bit, like that could be yelling, it could be aggression. In the older learner, it could be sarcasm. It could be passive aggressiveness back. It could be, on a younger kid, it could be shutting down. Not just a younger kid, anybody, it could be shutting down. It could be climbing under a table, like who knows? But what declarative language does, so as we said before, imperatives and question asking create a demand, which can result in a stress response. When we use declarative communication in this way, we are not placing a demand, and therefore we're much less likely to trigger that stress response. And therefore our learner is better able or can just stay engaged for longer periods of time because they feel safe. We're not placing any demands or pressure on them that they feel worried or anxious about.
When I first started working as a teacher and as a counselor and was working with parents specifically, and this was before I had my own kids, I look back now and I'm like, why did those parents listen to me? Because I think having been a parent, it kind of shifts some of those things, and like that lived experience is very different. And so I'm curious, have you used this with your own kids, and has it influenced how you interact with them, like being aware of this and thinking about it?
Absolutely. I use it with my kids. We're all human, so we're all imperative and question asking at times. But when I'm at my best, I'm declarative. And it just, I like to think it really makes our connection with each other stronger. They're open to things that I say because I'm not going to place a demand on them really quickly. On the foundation level, it strengthens our relationship. And when you have a strong relationship, the sky's the limit, but that's the foundation. It's not just about the tricks or what words you say. It's really about establishing that strong foundational relationship that can handle the ups and downs of life. So declarative language really helps create that. But then with my kids, I see them assume responsibility for problem solving, sometimes take initiative with helping out or different tasks, like not always, of course. But I just feel like it keeps our connection positive, and that's what I like about it the most. Like I don't feel like I'm always nagging them. Like sometimes I probably feel like I am. But I also know I can walk away and try again, give a space, come back around.
Yeah. I know sometimes with my kids, I'll do different strategies and I'll try, use declarative language. And eventually it's like, until it is that directive, until it is like do the thing now. It's like, oh, you were serious about that? And I don't know, maybe that's, there are probably a lot of factors at play with that. It's not like it's logistically the cure-all in any way, I think. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. Well, and even so what you were saying, like sometimes we might use a statement and it doesn't seem to work in the way that we had hoped. I do, talk a lot about troubleshooting steps and how to like scaffold those moments where there's a breakdown. So even one thing that I think about right away is, okay, I made this declarative statement. They didn't respond. Did I successfully secure their attention, for example, prior to making that statement? And I have tips of this nature on my website, but also in the book, there's a chapter on this. But one of the very first tweaks that I make or I guide other parents or teachers to make is, just make sure you've secured their attention first. So it might be something like getting closer. Sometimes we're just too far away and the language doesn't travel across the room, and that Lego set or that video game is much more salient to them at that moment in time than my language. So I might need to get closer. Sometimes I need to call their name. Maybe I tap their shoulder, and then I pause and I wait for them to reference me. Maybe they reference me visually. Maybe they say what. Sometimes I might use a declarative statement to secure their attention. Like I might say, I have something really important to tell you. Let me know when you're ready. And then I wait. And all those things really help the next declarative statement where I'm saying the content or the message I really want them to receive. It helps that be received much more successfully. So I feel like, sometimes you need the imperative, but sometimes, if you have the time and space to do it, you can troubleshoot it a little bit and remain declarative. And it just really helps also put the spotlight on us to reflect, like, okay, I'm a communicator in this moment, and what are ways that I can more successfully communicate with my learners so that they receive my message? What are the changes I can make? Which again, like that's what declarative communication also is all about. It's the changes we can make. So often we're directed on what we want to get the learner to do, which creates demands and externalizes the pressure or whatever it might be. Whereas I love this because it just brings it back to me. And I'm just thinking about, okay, what can I do differently in this moment to support our successful communication so we stay connected and learn and grow together?
More in a minute.
So has your child been diagnosed as twice exceptional, meaning gifted with one or more other learning challenges? There's a chance that you're in a school system that isn't prepared and equipped to maximize your child's learning potential. It's probably not their fault, but The fact is, finding support for these unique learners can be really, really hard. But now there's an outstanding option online. Bridges Academy has been educating and supporting twice exceptional learners for 25 plus years. And in 2021, Bridges began offering an online high school program for 2E students. At Bridges Academy Online, you find small class sizes, a faculty and administrators who are experts in 2E education. And at Bridges, they focus on talent development as a bridge to college and career, because 2E kids thrive when they have a chance to do their best in their areas of interest. Hop onto their website, bridges.edu now. This could be the best thing that you do for your kiddo. I do really love that it seems that parents and teachers today are just focusing so much on developing the skills, like really working on the skills specifically of regulation and attention and motivation, more than in the past when I think kids were quite often just trying to or expected to figure it out on their own. And one of the tools in terms that I've started to hear more frequently is about co-regulation, which I think goes hand in hand with that declarative language piece. So what is co-regulation and how can we integrate that into our relationships?
Yeah, and I know like so many people are talking about co-regulation these days, which is exciting. I'm a speech language pathologist, so my lens is always social communication. And as I think about co-regulation, I'm also an RDI consultant, and this is where I've learned about both these concepts. We think about co-regulation using Alan Fogel's definition in his book, Developing Through Relationships. And what that definition is just that we're in sync moment to moment with another person. So as a communicator, that means I come to the table open to the dynamic nature of communication. You know, I might, as a parent, caregiver, teacher, therapist, I might have an idea of things that I would like to accomplish, but I don't come with a very strict agenda around how we're going to do it, the pace that we're going to do it, the way that we're going to get there, because I'm one person in the exchange. I really have to completely be present to the other person in the moment and the communication that they're sending to me, so that I can respond in that moment in time. Mm-hmm. The way we think about co-regulation, or the way that I talk about it in my book, is that we're partners in each interaction. And the three terms that I use are competent, authentic, and contingent. So within any interaction, I want to ensure that the learner has a competent role. And that just means that they can do it on their own as long as I give them enough time, maybe a little bit of help. Their role is authentic, so it has to be really and truly meaningful and real in the moment. And contingent, which means we're doing it together. We need each other to get the job done, or for that interaction to unfold. We really and truly need each other and our unique exchanges in each moment in time. And so how I think about co-regulation and declarative language is that declarative language is a way of speaking and also a communicative presence, like we talked about. And co-regulation is a way of being. So declarative language helps me know what to say, but co-regulation helps me know how to be. Like I need to be present in that moment, and the words and the communication that I use is going to respond uniquely to my learner in each moment in time.
So give me an example of something that would kind of exhibit those characteristics of being competent, authentic, and contingent.
Yeah. So maybe I'll use getting out the door in the morning, or something like wanting to support our learner to put their shoes on to get out the door in the morning.
Yeah.
Or it could be similarly, in the classroom, helping them get their coat on to get out the door. So I might say to my child, say it's my child, I might say, I notice you need your shoes. And that declarative statement in that moment, I'm present, which means I'm going to pause, wait, observe, see how they respond, give them time to process the language. If my child were then to say, oh yeah, right, I need my shoes, and goes and grabs them, we're great, we're together. My role was the reminder in that moment. His role was the getter and the putter-oner, which he was competent in. Another example might be if I said the same thing like, I notice you need your shoes, and I give that time to process, but my learner does not move ahead. So being present in that moment in time, I think, okay, for whatever reason, that role is not competent for him at this moment in time because he's not doing it on his own. So therefore, how can I create a different partnership so that we move through this fluidly and positively together? So then my next scaffold might be something like, you know what? I'll get your shoes and bring them to you, and you can put them on. So then our roles in that moment change to me, shoe getter, him, shoe putter oner. And then another level, if the student or the child needed just even a little bit more support. So if I bring the shoes to the child and they still don't put them on, then in my head I say, okay, there's something getting in the way right now. Maybe it's time pressure, maybe it's fine motor skills, maybe they're distracted a little bit, whatever it is, they're not competent at this moment in time. So I want to create that competent role and partnership. Like I could give them more time to see if giving them more time to execute that motor plan is helpful. But if I'm in a rush and I just want to get out the door, then my competent roles at that point might be, tell you what, I'll put on the left shoe and you can put on the right. Or how about if I hold up the shoe and you stick your foot in? Or how about if I put the shoes on and you do the Velcro? Like those are each just different examples that you could use to create that partnership in that moment, or that competent, authentic, contingent roles, supported by my declarative statements, which are positive, inviting, and guiding.
I'm trying to think also, like, even for older kids as well.
Mm-hmm.
How might this fit in with something that they might, like, for example, one of the tasks that we often have to get done in the evenings that is probably difficult just in general is getting homework done, which I feel like is a little bit different because you can see how my role there, it's a little bit harder maybe sometimes to adjust it, but maybe I'm not thinking about it in a flexible enough way.
Yeah. And so with these questions too, like what I love to do with caregivers, with teachers, is just to get super specific, because if ever we feel stuck, there's no cookie cutter answer. Co-regulation is about being present in the moment and thinking about all the pieces that are present for that learner and that exchange in that moment in time. So if someone were just to say, like, homework's really hard, what should I do? I would say, well, can you tell me a little bit more so I understand where you feel stuck? Like, I'm wondering, I'm just going to be curious with the caregiver. Like, I'm wondering, is all of it hard? Is the initiation hard? Is it math that's hard? Mm-hmm. Where are you getting stuck? Because wherever it is you might be getting stuck, that's where the learner does not have a competent role. Mm-hmm. And I want to approach it thinking about, like, okay, getting started is hard. Mm-hmm. They won't even sit down at the table. Then I would say, okay, initiating homework is not a competent role. So let's think about how we can create a competent role there. And there, I know I said this before, but there's no quick fixes or recipes. So sometimes you have to build things over time. It's hard to just try something in the moment and expect it to work. It's more that you have to build the narrative over time. Mm-hmm. So for a child who maybe has trouble getting started, you might start a day or two ahead and just say, I've been thinking a lot about homework and I notice it's really hard to get started. I'm wondering if it might help if we just set a time for you to start and I sit down with you just to help you get going. Mm-hmm. And then, I'll walk away. Or I'm wondering if it might help you if I make you a snack at 4:00 and the snack is there and ready for you to sit down and get started on your homework. It all depends. I'm just like brainstorming different ideas, but it's always going to be just super specific to the student, to the caregiver, how to create that competent role. Mm-hmm. There's one blog post that I have on my website, and I think I call it something like just reframing non-preferred tasks. Mm. So everybody loves to say, oh, my child, my student, et cetera, won't do non-preferred tasks. But I'm like, that's generalizing or using a really broad stroke to talk about a lot of different things. So we can't just say they don't do non-preferred tasks. We really have to look at one individual task and think about what about that specific task is not competent right now, and really peel apart maybe the individual demands that are on a particular task and really, peel back the onion. Like, okay, I know math is not their favorite thing, but let's think about all the different demands that come with a math problem. There's mental, there's fine motor demands, there might be postural demands if you have to sit at a table. So when you come to word problems, there could be comprehension demands, language demands. So it's not helpful to just lump non-preferred tasks into one bucket, it's really most helpful to think about them very specifically, with respect to each task or activity or routine, but also with respect to each moment in time. And then from there, think about, okay, what's a competent role? And, it might feel overwhelming, but really that's where you get the good momentum going. Like if you can go back and just find that competent role, create that for our learners, everything builds upon that learning and that success. But when we start with the bar way too hard and everybody not feeling competent, not successful, then kids and our learners don't engage at all. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's just finding that place where they'll join the engagement readily.
On the surface level, if people are listening and hearing some of these things, it can sound like just another way to try to get kids to comply. Mm-hmm. But what I really like about it, and I think is the shift, is that it's really about bringing kids into the process. It's not really about compliance, but it's about building independence and self-efficacy and even the ability for them to set boundaries as well.
Yeah. And again, I think it goes back to the relationship. So it's never, I kind of use this mantra of give over get. Like the more we try and get, the more it feels like compliance, the more the kids might push back. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we really do have to put in the time of giving with declarative communication, being generous with information, just to flip the dynamic of the relationship and the communication from negative or power struggle-y, if that's a word, to positive, guiding, etc. Like sometimes I do hear like, oh, my kid would never do that, or they wouldn't let me sit down with them at the table and do homework. They would hate that. But what that tells me in the moment is they're not terribly open to our guidance. Mm-hmm. And what we really want to get at is this relationship where kids are open to our guidance, and also that we're in tune with when to provide that guidance and give them just the right amount of guidance. So it's just really tuning into each other so that we can build over time. So it always just comes back to that relationship and creating that relationship of safety, of trust, of positive communication, so that the rest can build from there.
Can you tell me a little bit about what episodic memory is and how it fits into this?
Yes. So episodic memory just means that, so we all have a collection of memories and experiences over the course of our lives. And when we have strong episodic memory, what that means is that we can pull a memory of a past experience that's relevant or matches in some way to the situation right now. And episodic memory is really crucial for everything in life. Anytime we're in a new situation, if we have strong episodic memory, we don't panic because we're able to pull a similar but different memory from our past. So one example that I talk about in my book and in some of the trainings that I do is I remember when I was in college and I went to what was Czechoslovakia at the time and went to a grocery store. And I just really remember how different it was. The food was different. The language was different. And if I had focused on the differences, I probably would have been really scared. I probably would have gone into fight, flight, or freeze because I wouldn't have known what to do. But I'm fortunate that my brain could recognize the pattern of grocery store. And therefore, even though so much was different, I could navigate that competently enough because I know what to do in a grocery store. So you just think, okay, for our learners who can't as easily access those similar but different patterns, every time they're in a new situation, that can also just create feelings of not being competent, not knowing what to do, anxiety. And where I talk about this in declarative language is that declarative language is just so wonderful because it allows us so many opportunities to help kids access their episodic memory in the moment. So if you notice you're in a new situation with your learner, but you also remember a similar but different situation or experience from the past, in that moment, you can narrate that using declarative language, which will likely ease their anxiety. So you're in a restaurant, it's a new restaurant, it smells different. You might say something like, I know this restaurant is different, but it really reminds me of the restaurant that we went to last year with Grandma. And I also remember that in restaurants, the pattern is generally the same. You wait to get seated, then someone's going to give you a menu, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can really use declarative language to narrate and spotlight those similar patterns so that your learner can also then perceive them and be less frightened by the differences.
I think a lot of this that we've talked about really involves giving kids time to process.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I think when we're feeling rushed, it can feel super overwhelming. We get dysregulated as adults. What are some considerations that might be helpful when we notice that kids aren't responding to us? Like how much time with any of these things, whether it's accessing that episodic memory or responding to the declarative language, how much time is appropriate, do you think?
Yeah, well, everybody knows their learner, so it'll be different, and it depends on the situation. When you're getting started with declarative language, what I always say is start at a time and place that you don't feel rushed so that you can practice that waiting because it is an important piece. And you're not always going to have to wait as long, but starting out, you really want to feel that flow and you really want to feel the power of waiting. So as you get started and you set yourself up in a situation where you don't feel rushed, I would say count to 30 in your head. And 30 is a very long time, but often you're not going to get that far. But if you give yourself 30 seconds, then you're definitely going to give that learner enough time. And chances are they might chime in sooner.
Yeah.
So I think that's a flow to begin with. But then also just separately, so those are in the moment interactions. But then I think it's also always so important to know that processing over the course of days is also really, really important and valuable. So you might be thinking about a conversation that you want to have or a routine that you want to invite your learner to be a part of. And if you ask them in the moment, they might be the type of learner that just says no, like that defensive reaction goes up really quickly. So what I say could be helpful instead is to just say, hey, I've been thinking about X, Y, and Z. I'd love for us to talk about it, or I'd love for us to give this a try, but not today. Tomorrow after school, I was thinking we could give this a try. So you even just projected a little bit into the future, which really allows the learner time to process and integrate that information with their greater world experiences and knowledge. And then I'd say 9 times out of 10, they are ready when you come back around the next day or the next week because you've afforded them that time. It really makes such a huge difference. So and again, that's part of co-regulation is just understanding in the moment our communication and what will be most successful for us as a team.
So Linda, I'm so grateful for your time today. My last question as we wrap up is this. If you could leave our audience with like just one piece of advice or one tip, something we could send them on their way and help them integrate some of these new strategies to improve their relationships and connect with their kids, what would you want them to hear?
I would say, as you give declarative language a try, don't give up. I would say don't expect it to work right away, but hang in there. And I'd also say set yourself up for success. And I know I just said this, but really and truly give it a try at a time when you feel available to be present in that way so that you can really see all the beauty that it brings.
Linda Murphy, author of The Declarative Language Handbook. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I think it's important to note with a conversation like this, not every strategy is going to work for every person, nor is any strategy going to work all the time. I know there are many neurodivergent kids and adults who benefit from very straightforward and direct communication, and they might be confused by this type of language. However, for those who tend to be more avoidant in tasks or when your relationship is stressed, this can help. Personally, I've been working on being more cognizant of this strategy with my own kids after I finished recording this interview, and I've tried to be more observant about what is working and what isn't. You want to know one of the most tangible things that I notice? Even more than how using declarative language impacts my kids, it helps me not become so frustrated. The difference between, I need you to go put your dish in the dishwasher, and, hey, I notice your dish is still on the counter, not only impacts my kids, but it impacts me. I'm less irritated because I'm making an observation instead of a demand. Give it a try and see what works and what doesn't for your family. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Before we go, I wanted to remind you how important your reviews are to our podcast. Apple Podcasts and some of the other platforms welcome your review, so if you don't mind, would you write a quick one for us? Our thanks again to Linda Murphy. We have links to her work and books on the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. The executive producer, that is me, Dave Morris. And our staff dog is Cooper Morris. For all of us here, good boy. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.